It's been a long absence, and that is largely due to two reasons. One, the beginning of the year is the busiest time for me in terms of my day job, and two, I have been a bit depressed and prioritizing my mental health, which, if I cover it, will be in a different video. But I had to come out of the fog to say something about this wildly salacious article titled Brandon Sanderson is Your God, which was published on Wired, which Daniel Greene ranted about, and which other YouTubers have also covered. I have some thoughts to share, and I think that they will be a bit different from what others have covered so far. First, I didn't think the article was unhinged. That's at least not how I would describe it. If I'm honest, I had kind of a mixed reaction to it. I think it's pretentious and mean, but I don't think that it is entirely wrong. At least, not on every point. Second, as someone who was an English major and an English language arts teacher and now works in marketing PR, I have a slightly different perspective on some of what this article alleges about the works of Brandon Sanderson, as well as why it exists at all. If you have not read the article, I will summarize it briefly. Again, the article appeared on Wired on March 23rd, 2023. It is authored by Jason Kehe, whose name I hope I am pronouncing correctly. It is titled, Brandon Sanderson is Your God. The article is an opinion piece written in the first-person perspective. In the article, Kehe shares that he doesn't think that Brandon Sanderson is a very good writer. In fact, he thinks that Sanderson is rather a bad writer. He is mystified at how Sanderson became this wildly successful juggernaut of fantasy, able to raise over $41 million in a Kickstarter. This is especially confusing to Kehe given that Sanderson agrees that he is not a very good writer. He writes to relax, he writes to get to endings, and he hates to rewrite. Given this approach, Kehe wonders why Sanderson gives so much advice on writing to new writers. Despite being on the bestsellers list many times, Sanderson has largely been ignored by major publications, something that Sanderson's own publicist confirms when Kehe calls to ask about it. Presumably, this wouldn't be true if Sanderson was actually any good at writing. Kehe also makes pretentious jabs at Sanderson for having little fashion sense, poor taste in cuisine and films, and that his conversation is quote-unquote lame. He also insinuates that how much Sanderson writes and his inability to slow down or rest might be a sign of a mental health disorder. Kehe also throws fans of Sanderson under the bus. He attended Dragonsteel conference and he comments that it is mostly men and boys and man boys who he describes as pale and fleshy. He quips about adult men spending gobs of money on toy swords and that these toy swords have names. He recounts that fans of Sanderson boast about how nerdy they are, and he is frustrated that no one he talks to at the convention can tell him why they particularly like Brandon Sanderson's books. Kehe wants you to know that he is not a snob, though, while definitely sounding like a snob. Other people, not him, relegate fantasy as a sub-literary genre. But he likes fantasy and science fiction, which he lumps together as the same thing. They are not. He likes the profound questions that this genre poses. I would argue that science fiction poses more profound questions than fantasy, and that lumping them together does the genre a disservice. Kehe references Margaret Atwood, who is a sci-fi writer and is certainly also a message-driven writer. But Brandon Sanderson is not up to the caliber of Margaret Atwood, in Kehe's opinion, or George R.R. Martin or J.K. Rowling. Sanderson writes more, but less well, and doesn't seem bothered by it. Then there's an odd twist. Kehe acknowledges that people love Sanderson because of his world building, but Kehe notes that Sanderson's world building may be rooted in his religion, Mormonism. Mormonism, he says, is founded on a kind of sci-fi fantasy idea that there are many worlds that men can, one day, populate. Sanderson is Mormon, all his family and friends are Mormon, and the staff that run Dragonsteel are mostly Mormon. Sanderson writes about many worlds, the Cosmere, in which men can become gods. Kehe insinuates that Sanderson is building a fantasy world that reflects the Mormon theology. Kehe then takes this hypothesis to kind of a weird place. He says that Sanderson is himself becoming a god of a world on Earth, one of his creation, the world that he is building through Dragonsteel Entertainment. Sanderson has throngs of fans who love him, who worship him, you might say, which is due to his productivity, personal branding, and communion with the people. So, what is the point of this article, and does it have any merit? Again, I don't think that this article is unhinged. It's not how I describe it, but it is definitely odd. The implication that Brandon Sanderson is some kind of egoist, despite Kehe also finding him to be modest to the point of being boring, is particularly strange. I've met Brandon Sanderson once at a book signing. He's a very nice guy. He's very generous with his time, and he's very active with his fan base, as most of his fans know. Okay, he tries to twist this generosity to seem self-serving, and while I don't totally agree, I do have to acknowledge that that's also not exactly wrong. It can be observed that Sanderson puts a lot of energy into marketing himself and his personal brand. A lot of writers are quiet. They let their work speak for itself. Sanderson does not take this approach. Sanderson markets himself way more than most authors do. He makes videos, he does interviews, he's on podcasts and Reddit AMAs and popular blogs. He is an active participant in his own fandom. And he has founded an entertainment company for his fandom. All of that does a lot to build brand name recognition, which helps him sell books, more books than other authors who may write better but talk about themselves a lot less. And it is possible that Sanderson learned something about how to market himself and why that's worth doing from religion. I also have to agree, although it pains me to confess it, that in my estimation, Brandon Sanderson is not a very good writer. I don't think that he is lame, not by a long shot, but I do not read Brandon Sanderson for the crafted beauty of his sentences. There is a reason that major publications and literary critics have largely ignored him. His books, while very entertaining, don't really meet the standard for literature, not even by a sub-genre fantasy standard, which is why they don't get a lot of traditional publicity. This doesn't mean that I do not like Brandon Sanderson, either as a person or an author. I do. I have many of his books displayed on my wall. He is just not my favorite fantasy writer. When Brandon Sanderson says that he writes for endings, I personally feel this when I read his books. Some of them are a slog to get through, with the exception of the first Mistborn series, which I think had to go through more rewriting and editing in order to get published than his later books because they were among his earlier books. Sanderson's plotting is not what I would describe as tight. I almost gave up on Rhythm of War. Like all of the other Stormlight Archive books, the ending was pretty good, but much of that book just rehashed things that we had learned in the previous book about the Parshendi, just at a slower pace, and is a chunker of a novel. But I also liked the endings of The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance and Oathbringer, so I stuck with it. And I enjoyed the ending of Rhythm of War too, but I can't really tell you what happens in the middle of any of the Stormlight Archive books. I only read them once, and a lot of the stuff that happens is kind of just unmemorable for me. Again, except for the endings. I don't feel a lot of emotional attachment to the characters either, despite that they suffer a lot and feel like individualized people. I don't know exactly why I don't feel attached to them, but it has to be because of the writing. I was very interested to read Kehe's interview where he asks Sanderson if he gets emotional when he writes. I know I do when I write. I write with a lot of feeling. It doesn't seem that Sanderson does, though, except, again, at the endings. Apparently, if Kehe could be believed, Sanderson doesn't feel that much most of the time in his everyday life. His wife jokes that he is kind of like a robot. He doesn't even enjoy roller coasters. He doesn't smile when he's on them. And I don't want to speculate on whether or not this is normal. I don't know. It's not my normal, but I think it was interesting to read about in this article because I had never considered that I might not feel attached to Sanderson's characters because Sanderson himself doesn't feel that much when he's writing about them. This is especially poignant for me right now because I have been very focused on my mental health lately, and I was attracted to the Stormlight Archive series because I heard that it was about characters who were struggling with their mental health. And yet, when I read Sanderson's books, there's this sort of dry, perfunctory quality to it, like he's plodding from one scene to the next, following a pattern, executing on a plan, building toward an ending that might be worth it, but that doesn't engage me in the moment, at least not as much as other writers, even when the subject matter is personally interesting to me. I also find Sanderson's world building to be too complex for my personal taste sometimes. I I appreciate the depth and intricacy. I think it's phenomenal what he has been able to accomplish, but I am not someone who wants to have to read a wiki to understand the book that I am reading in the moment. If you can't get me to understand the magic system in the story as I read it, it's just not going to be among my favorite books. And I have read thousands and thousands of pages in the Stormlight Archives, but I can't tell you all the orders of the Knights Radiance, and I don't know how their powers work and how they differ from each other. There are just too many details, and I forget them constantly. There are characters that appear in those books that are from other books in the Cosmere that I know nothing about, and I am not made to care about them in the book that I am reading. As soon as I finished Rhythm of War, I promptly forgot what Knight's Order Navani belongs to. I still don't know, and that was the main plot of that book. I just can't seem to keep it all in my head, and I'm sure that I would enjoy the series more if I participated in the fandom between books, but I don't. I read the books for the books, and then I move on. But this doesn't mean that Sanderson books aren't worth reading. The endings do tend to be great, especially in the Stormlight Archive. The magic systems are very creative and the world building is very immersive. They just aren't my favorites because I resent having to stop to research the world and the magic system and remind myself who this or that character is just to understand what is going on. But I do like the ideas. I think that they are fun reads, and anyone who enjoys fantasy probably will enjoy Brandon Sanderson's books, at least some of them. When it comes to the themes of mental health, I do have to point out that I am not sure that I am learning about mental health disorders from Brandon Sanderson and his characters. I think he's kind of making stuff up as he goes. He has the general gist of these are people who are struggling with these things, and we are on a journey with them for redemption and eventual power and godhood status. But it's not like it's helping me to understand what it's like to be a person who is depressed, how to overcome depression, or what it's like to be a character who has disassociative personality states and what it takes to overcome that particular challenge. It feels more like it's a gimmick to get you to find the characters interesting and to invest in the novel, and I'm just not really sure that that works for me. My computer just crashed for like the 10th time in the course of making this video, which is another reason why I haven't made as many videos lately, because I bought this super fancy computer and all this equipment, and it just keeps bugging out, which is not the greatest. Fortunately, I do have an emotional support animal now, so, we'll carry on from where we were and try to get to the end of this thing. So, what was I talking about? Mental health. I do have to credit the author of the Wired article for pointing out that the ideas in Sanderson's books are a bit repetitive and do seem to parallel ideals of Mormonism, at least you could interpret it that way. The main characters in the Stormlight Archive are sinners, you could argue, who are broken men and women redeemed through the ideals of the Knights Radiant, which is a lost religion. And I absolutely love this idea, but I can see that it is somewhat in parallel to some beliefs in Mormonism, and also appears in other books that Sanderson has written. In Mistborn, you also have a lot of commentary on false gods and false narratives, with characters who, again, achieve a kind of godhood status through faith and works. This doesn't bother me, though. I think it would be silly to expect an author to leave their beliefs at the door when it comes to their writing. Of course, what you write is going to reflect what you believe. And I don't think that Sanderson's Cosmere is to Mormonism what the Narnia Chronicles was to Christianity. There's also a lot in Sanderson's books that I don't think the Church of Latter-day Saints would approve if it was some kind of, secret curriculum to tempt people into Mormonism, which I don't think that it is. And besides which, it's a fantasy series. I left Christianity years ago, but I still like the Narnia Chronicles. All fantasies have a bit of religion in them. The more robustly developed, the better. That's what magic systems are. But I don't know why Kehe fixates on Mormonism in particular in this article. He does not connect the dots for you. He doesn't say anything about why being Mormon in particular is problematic versus, say, some other religion that Sanderson might ascribe to. And I say that as someone who finds a lot to object to in Mormonism, but I have to fill in the blanks for this article because it's not telling me what the author thinks about Sanderson's religion. There's just kind of this insinuation that there's something wrong about it. Kehe doesn't reference any common issues that people have with Mormonism. He doesn't say that Mormonism oppresses women or is anti-LGBTQ or that it has a racist history. He doesn't say that the foundations of the religion are based on a lie and that its founder was a con artist. He doesn't talk about polygamy. He doesn't explain that the Church of Latter-day Saints is essentially a cult that tries to control its members with a lot of weird rules and grandiose promises about what people will get for obeying those rules when they die. He doesn't talk about people who leave the church are excommunicated and cut off from their friends and family forever if they, profess not to believe in the religion anymore. He doesn't talk about how the Church of Latter-day Saints has been creating an empire through the ownership of this large portfolio of businesses or the large swaths of real estate that they own in Utah and other states. To my knowledge, Dragonsteel LLC does not give any profits directly to the Church of Latter-day Saints, but all of its members probably do tithe, including Brandon Sanderson, and I'll bet that the church also see proceeds in other ways, since they own quite a bit of real estate in Salt Lake City. But none of this is mentioned in the article. It doesn't tell you why any of this matters. It assumes that you just know. And he probably doesn't elaborate because supporting these kinds of statements is exhausting, and dragging Mormonism is not the point of this article, at least I don't think that it is. This article is not an investigative piece on how Mormonism is supported, however vicariously, by Brandon Sanderson's Dragonsteel company. It doesn't accuse Sanderson of peddling dangerous ideas. It doesn't insinuate that buying Sanderson's books or attending the Sanderson conference is on par with supporting anti-women and anti-LGBTQ ideology or anything like that. It's not trying to cancel Sanderson for not being liberal enough for the left or too liberal for the right. It's not a political article at all, unless you read between the lines and insert something there. The point of the article, I think, is to try to articulate what drives Brandon Sanderson to write and why people read his work to the degree that they do. What does Sanderson care about? Why does he write so much? Kehe explains that Mormons often talk about a feeling like a burning in the bosom when they pray for guidance about what they should do with their lives. So he hypothesizes that maybe Brandon Sanderson writes out of religious fervor, but Brandon Sanderson doesn't really bite at that idea when asked. He says it's too personal. If Sanderson was a zealot and was writing some kind of a pamphlet for why you should convert to Mormonism, which again I don't think makes sense, this would have been his moment to evangelize, but he doesn't. It's at this point that Kehe says that in all the time he spent with Sanderson, the only really interesting thing that Sanderson said was toward the end of this conversation, when Sanderson spoke 7 words of truth. As I build books, God builds people. Kehe thinks this is interesting because it seems to answer for him the question of why Sanderson writes. What is the point of Dragonsteel LLC? Why does Sanderson feel compelled to write so much that his days need to be scheduled in minute increments, where he has to plan for family time and where he needs to write until he drops, but produces writing that even he himself doesn't think is that good? Wouldn't his fans be happier with fewer books that were of better quality? He has plenty of money already, so it can't be that unless there's just an inherent greed component, which I don't get from Sanderson. And it's apparently not a love for the craft of writing, because he says he writes to relax. There also doesn't seem to be a particular message that he's trying to get across in the way that someone like Margaret Atwood would say was their, core reason for telling stories. So why? What drives Brandon Sanderson, and why do his fans love his work so much? Kehe concludes that Sanderson's drive to write is tied to his religion in a way, but only insofar in that Sanderson imagines himself as a creator with a capital C. He is the builder of books, the builder of worlds, the builder of a people. It is his fandom that will become immortalized when he passes on. And seemingly his fans will read whatever he writes, even if it's not very good, because they are attached to Sanderson himself. According to Kehe, they are unable to articulate what they even like about Sanderson's writing. They don't worship his books, they worship him. And this is why the article is titled, Brandon Sanderson is your god. Now, I am explaining Kehe's article, but that doesn't mean that I agree with it. I like Brandon Sanderson. I think he is a very nice man, and I enjoy his books quite a lot, even though they are not among my favorites. But he is not my god. I didn't go to the Sanderson convention, and if I had, and I was asked by this reporter what I thought of Brandon Sanderson's works, I would have told him the truth. They're great books, they're very creative, but they don't always give me what I need emotionally, and I don't think they're very tightly told. I think they could benefit from more rewriting, but I respect that Sanderson doesn't want to do that because he does not have to. If it inspires him to just write to get to the endings, that's his prerogative. People will read his stories anyway, so let him do what he wants. I don't personally slot Sanderson among my favorite authors because I enjoy a well-crafted story, but I don't look down on people who do. I think it's fine. I think this article is a bit unfair because it's trying to hold Sanderson up to a standard that Sanderson himself doesn't hold himself to. I don't think he's trying to be literary. I don't think he's trying to write the world's greatest novel. I think he just likes telling stories and publishing them and interacting with his fan base, and more power to him. He's very successful doing what he does. But I also don't think that this article is as bad as some of Sanderson's fans have reacted to it. It is mean and it's condescending, but it did get my attention and it started a conversation, and that's what a lot of writers are trying to do. So good job, Kehe. You got what you wanted with this piece. I mean, we can ask the same question of Kehe that Kehe asks of Sanderson. Why did you write this article? What was the drive? What do you want? Kehe tells us that Sanderson's Kickstarter is what inspired him to write about Sanderson. Specifically, he writes, on the day of his record-breaking Kickstarter campaign, 42 million of that 55 million, I came to the Wired offices ready to gossip. How'd he do it? Why now? Is Brandon Sanderson even a good writer? Nobody had the first clue who or what I was talking about. So I think for Kehe, this is a classic mystery. Sanderson has millions of fans. Of course he does. Kehe knows that you can't make $42 million in a Kickstarter without millions of people putting money into that Kickstarter. But I think the bigger question is, why do people spend so much for Sanderson's work? And why is Sanderson only niche famous and not famous if people are willing to do that much for additional novels from him? I don't think it's really a lack of notoriety among the elite that bothers Kehe about Sanderson. There is a greater context here that Kehe doesn't explain. Sanderson's Kickstarter set tongues wagging in the traditional media and publishing houses. It was, and is, offensive to some people, especially writers, and Kehe is a writer. Now, it must be mentioned that some people are offended because they are jealous. That's a tale as old as time. Robert Greene was very jealous of William Shakespeare for a very similar reason. Shakespeare produced a lot of plays that were very popular, but which other writers at the time didn't find to be as sophisticated as their own poetry. Greene is famous in particular for calling Shakespearean an upstart crow, beautified by our feathers. In other words, why is this guy getting so much attention just because he is so prolific? He writes for commoners. Sound familiar? But not everyone is offended because of jealousy. Sanderson talks about his Kickstarter as if it's something every writer can or should be doing, that the way of the traditional publishing houses is out of date and stale. And he's kind of right, but not entirely. While publishing houses should be updating their marketing tactics and helping authors to build personal brands through social media, it is not something that every writer can do. A lot of writers are shy, introverted people who don't know the first thing about how to market themselves and aren't comfortable doing it. A lot of writers spend 10 years or a whole lifetime to write one perfect novel. In the traditional process, agents who are more extroverted represent writers, and publishing houses get their work into the hands of readers. Sanderson is more prolific and cares less about the craft of writing than most writers. As mentioned previously, he also doesn't seem to feel a lot, or at least his feelings don't affect him overtly, which kind of is a gift when it comes to self-promotion, because maybe it doesn't bother him as much to put himself out there, and maybe he doesn't realize that that is a lot harder for other people to do. And that might rub some writers the wrong way. It doesn't personally bother me, though. Sanderson isn't the only writer who takes a crank and ship approach to producing writing. He is the publisher's dream because he produces, and he is not alone. Stephen King has a similar reputation in horror, Nora Roberts in romance. Publishers love authors who produce because they always have something to sell. The crank and ship approach has always existed and has always bothered writers who are more meticulous about their writing and are more interested and inclined to craft something that is exquisite but takes longer to do. Susanna Clarke is that kind of fantasy author. It took her 10 years to write Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but I like the handful of books that she has written more than I like the dozens of books that Sanderson has put out over the years. But which authors are the best is a subjective thing. Brandon Sanderson got a huge boost of notoriety when he finished Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, and I know you knew that this was coming. I am very grateful to Brandon Sanderson for finishing Wheel of Time. I am sure that he was chosen in part because he has this crank and ship approach to writing. He would get it done. That being said, the Brandon Sanderson installments in the Wheel of Time series are my least favorite books in the series. Not everyone feels that way. I know a lot of people who think that they're better than Robert Jordan's books. I'm just not one of them. I think Memory of Light is the worst book in the series. I like Crossroads of Twilight, in which almost nothing happens except people reacting to the end of Winter's Heart, better than any of the Sanderson books that come after it. And that's not to say I don't like anything in the Sanderson books. There are quite a few scenes that I like, but I tend to like the scenes that Robert Jordan wrote himself, like the Tower of Genji, or at least where he is providing a lot more detail in the notes than when Sanderson is giving his own ideas and writing the story in his own way. Memory of Light to me is just kind of a mess. I like the ending, as I tend to do with Sanderson books, but the novel as a whole feels poorly structured and rambling to me, and I struggle to get through it. I also cringe a lot when I'm reading it. But again, that's subjective. A lot of people love that book. They think it's the best one of the series. Again, I don't think it's fair to judge Sanderson's writing the way Kehe does in this article because I don't think Sanderson is trying to be literary. I would qualify him more as gen pop in the fantasy genre, and I don't think that that description would displease him. I am not sure how well his books would adapt to screen, but they might actually be better in a film medium than when reading them as a text. Sometimes Sanderson writes as if he's articulating stage directions. I find his action scenes kind of hard to follow because there is a lot of body positioning, but not a lot of setting description and not always a clear articulation of the stakes. Like when people are fighting, I want to know why does this matter more than I care where someone's elbow is positioned in juxtaposition to someone else's throat. There's also a curious lack of emotional impact, but on the screen, this wouldn't be an issue. I think The Final Empire, the first of the Mistborn series, would actually be a wonderful movie for a lot of reasons. It's also not literary quality, but I think it would be something on par with, like, an installment in the MCU. And I hope that Sanderson gets that adaptation. Regardless of how good you think his writing is or how bad, he has the audience to make a movie about one of his books, any of his books, worthwhile. In this sense, I disagree with Kehe. I think Sanderson deserves his success. I think he has worked very hard for it, and I wish him more success to come. If he is trying to be a god or start a religion in which he's some kind of a cult leader, it is a very strange one because he's not narcissistic. He is a nice guy who writes a lot, and he interacts with his fans in a very casual, authentic, and transparent way. More power to him. You do you, Brandon Sanderson. And I think that that power will come. This article may have pissed you off. It pissed off a lot of people, but it was effective at getting people to talk about Sanderson, and as they say, all press is good press. And this will be my final point. The article that is in Wired could not have existed without Sanderson's cooperation. He has a publicist with whom Jason Kehe is acquainted. He says so right in the article. The time Kehe spent with Sanderson had to have been arranged with the intention and likely obligation that Kehe would write an article about Sanderson or Dragonsteel for Wired. Kehe had to write an article, and he ended up writing this article. Sanderson's staff probably paid for him to fly to the convention, bought his meals, set up his lodging, all of that, just for a chance to be in a major publication, which, as the author writes, Sanderson hasn't been able to achieve to date. It might even be the fault of the publicist or Sanderson himself. They didn't give this writer something more to work with. I don't know, I wasn't there. But it seems like this journalist was invited to follow Sanderson around and interview him, but Sanderson didn't answer any questions with any kind of tantalizing point of view that the writer could have used to write an interesting article. So he wrote one instead about his experience with Sanderson and these 7 words that he thought were the most meaningful things that Sanderson uttered during their time together. And again, I wasn't there, so perhaps Sanderson did give this journalist tons to work with and he just ignored it. Maybe they talked about his Kickstarter and why he did it and what he thinks other authors should do, but Kehe just didn't agree or didn't find it very interesting or unique from what has already been said about it. Maybe they talked about the roadmap for Dragonsteel, but the journalist found that too promotional to use in an article. Maybe Sanderson was wary of revealing too much about his personal thoughts and ideas and opinions because he worried that the article might turn out to be negative if he gave away too much. You can't control what journalists write about you. That is essential to freedom of the press, which is a basic right in America. Sometimes journalists write a different story than the one that you think you are giving them. I have been quoted in the press, and that has happened to me. It's common. Sanderson may not have experience working with real journalists from major publications. I think most of his experience is with social media, with bloggers and vloggers and people who are fans of his and are really excited to have him on their programs. Getting a staff writer for a major publication to do a write-up on you is a different experience. They need to have an angle. It needs to be interesting to their audience, which is not the same as your fandom. Sanderson wrote a response to Kehe's article that was very kind to him, acknowledging that the article sounds like it was difficult to write. He was hurt by how he was portrayed, and I don't blame him for feeling that way. It must have felt like a betrayal to spend all that time with someone, wait eagerly for the article to come out, and then read that. Maybe Sanderson would have had a better experience if he had chosen someone whose articles are a bit more positive. I looked up what other things Kehe has written about, and he's negative a lot of the time, so they kind of should have seen this coming. I can say, though, that it did a good job of drawing attention to Sanderson, and although you can't call it a glowing review, it is mean in a way that doesn't actually make Sanderson look that bad, or I would argue bad at all. I mean, the worst thing that Kehe says about Sanderson is he doesn't write very well, and Sanderson agrees with this statement. He is quantity over quality, that's his approach. Even the personal jabs aren't that bad. Sanderson's sports coat doesn't make him look professional. He is building an empire with himself as a central figure. So what? I don't think any of that is going to turn Sanderson's fans against him. So in a way, Kehe might be a malicious genius. Possibly there were terms for this article. Sanderson's publicist may have invited him to the convention on the stipulation that he writes an article for Wired. They may have wanted to be covered in a major publication regardless of what the topic of the article was because they know that it will broaden Sanderson's audience and they didn't care what the article was about as long as it drew eyeballs. I don't know. Again, this is a maybe. The article they got was a bit bratty, but I do think it was that way on purpose, and ultimately I think it was pretty effective in drawing attention to Dragonsteel. And that's Kehe's brand, which they would have known if they looked up other articles that he has written, because they're all written in a similar tone. Like, for example, he writes one about Encanto, the musical that I also covered in my YouTube channel, and I praised it thoroughly, but Kehe's like, why does this movie have to have a positive ending? Even though it's a Disney movie, because the, topic of intergenerational trauma doesn't usually end in that way, like in real life. Kehe knows that his opinions are pretty tart and that his tone will raise ire, but he's self-deprecating too, and as critical of snobs as he is of nerds. This article may be snarky and mean, but it was balanced and it was memorable. I think it was intended to upset Sanderson fans because they both know that Sanderson fans are going to respond, and that's going to get both Kehe and Sanderson more admirers. So it's a win-win from a publicity standpoint. I now know who Jason Kehe is, and a whole lot of Wired readers are now familiar with Brandon Sanderson. New audiences will give his book a read. All but the traffic to Wired is pretty good, and all but the same is true of Dragonsteel books. Next year's conference will be even bigger. A nice article would not have done nearly so much. In fact, a smart publicist might even have recommended a strategy like this. Oh, you're not getting covered by major news publications that find your writing trite or beneath their standards? Let's find a writer who will follow you around for a few days and do an in-depth interview on you. If it's a little mean, so much the better. It will piss off all your fans who will come to your defense, publish videos, write articles about you, and you'll get the attention of other major publications who either feel sorry for you or are curious about what you're all about. And that's the way we're going to get those movies made. In other words, I don't think it matters what Kehe meant by this piece. His point seems to be that Sanderson has manufactured a powerful brand for himself as a fantasy writer by grinding more than craft. And to that I say, duh. Sure, Sanderson's books are not literary masterpieces, but that's not what he's aiming for, and that's not why a lot of people read them. His books are entertaining and they're good fantasies. As for his advice on writing, if you want to write creatively and make money doing it, Sanderson's model is a good one to follow. His lectures focus a lot on frameworks to make you more productive and how to create consistent rules for worlds, and that's not bad advice. Finally, even if I disagree with a lot of what is in this article and find it underdeveloped in places, I did find it thought-provoking. I thought about it for a week straight. It made me think about why Brandon Sanderson hasn't had to defend being Mormon in the same way that Orson Scott Card has. It's also made me think a lot about mental health and Brandon Sanderson's mental health in particular, especially as he is writing a series about characters who have mental health problems. I can't imagine that reading this article would have felt good to Brandon Sanderson, and I am sorry for him for that. I have seen him claim that he is not a depressed person, but I wonder, would he necessarily know? Especially if he struggles to feel at all the way this article alleges. I didn't think that I was depressed until I started going to therapy for what I thought was a singularly upsetting incident that I would eventually get over. But being in therapy has actually changed my perspective on my whole life, and I realized that I've been depressed for a lot longer than I was admitting to myself. But we'll have to save that topic for a different video because this one's already over long. Let me know your thoughts and comments, and please like this video so that it gets seen if you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. I know I haven't been prolific lately, certainly not to the degree that Brandon Sanderson is, but that's because I'm giving myself time and space for mental health. I am relaxing. I am playing video games. I am not trying to hold myself to a standard that has led me to feel underserved in the past, among other things that I have been challenged with, and I hope to feel better soon and to produce more videos in the future, and I hope that Sanderson also feels better soon and that he gets the movies that he so rightly deserves. Until next time, cheers.